Okay, let's get going. My name is Atanu. I'm a program manager in the SharePoint team, and I'm here to talk about BCS and Duet. Now, before I get going, I just wanted to get a quick show of hands. How many folks here actually know what either BCS is or Duet is? Okay, that's not bad. Okay, how many folks know what BCS is? Okay, and Duet? Okay, that's good. That's fortunate because when I structured the deck, I kind of assumed that most folks would have some level of familiarity, and so I haven't put a lot of background information. So this deck really is about what's new for 2013. I'm not planning to go over what we delivered, what we shipped in the last release. However, if you have a question, if something isn't clear, and you want to just clarify something, I'll be happy to talk about what we shipped last time as well. But it's not, you won't see that reflected in the slides. Okay. The other thing, just a quick mention, is that the network has been kind of flaky. All my demos depend on the network. What I did just now was the last 30 minutes, I did get a stable connection, so I've taken screenshots. If the connection stays up, we'll have a live demo. If it doesn't, you'll see me doing some fancy footwork and switching over to PowerPoint slides for the screenshots as well. So let's get going. Okay, so another quick show of hands. How many folks here are developer versus IT? So if you think you're on the development side of the house, just please raise your hands. Okay? And IT? Okay, kind of mixed group. Okay, so that's also good because the way I've structured this deck is I've put it together from the perspective of two characters, one who's an IT, an admin, essentially, and one who's a developer, and try to show both perspectives or both viewpoints, and you'll see that reflect as we go through this. So what I've done is I put a quick 4 or 5 slide intro that just gives you some context, and then I'm going to jump straight into what's new. So in terms of introduction, since I've asked you so many questions, I'm sure you won't mind one more. How many folks here are familiar with the new app model that we rolled out in this release? Okay, cool. So the background is pretty straightforward. I'm sure most of you live this every day. But you have information workers who need to take decisions. They need data for those decisions. They want as much access to data as they can get, and they want it freely, and they want to be able to do whatever they want with that data. But then you have IT admins whose job it is to make sure that data is securely managed, it's locked down, there's no leakage, and so you have these two worlds, and what you have in between is essentially a whole slew of apps. I just put a few there, but I mean we could go. The list of applications that IT has or uses endless, and most of these apps are actually not built by IT. I saw a guesstimate once that only about 25% of what apps that end users actually use are built by IT, and the rest 75% are built by what we call business unit IT folks, who are not core IT, but they build apps that information workers absolutely need. So what does that mean for a developer? It means that if a developer is building an app, and I'm going to talk about the new SharePoint app model as well, so you'll see some references to that. If he's building an app like that, he could just build data connectivity in, and he could hard code connection strings. He could put passwords in there, credentials in there. But then an admin would not be able to securely manage that, because then the next time a password needs to change, an admin would have no way of going in, things like that. So there needs to be a balance between developers building apps that leverage data, but still giving that some level of control to admins, so that those can be managed. And what BCS is, it's a way to integrate external data into SharePoint. Since most of you are familiar with BCS, I won't go too much into that. What I will show is some of the new tools that we added in this release. So we added some new Visual Studio tooling. We added a new concept around connections and management of connections, some new protocols, and some troubleshooting. And that's going to be the focus for this talk. Since most of you are familiar with BCS, I'm not going to really walk through this too much, except just to call out a couple of things. This slide looks almost identical to a slide that I could have shown in SharePoint 2010, except for if you look at the bottom, you'll see that there's a new connector. That's OData. And on this side, you'll see that just as before, there are two tools, SharePoint Designer and Visual Studio. But what I'm going to show you is that we've significantly boosted the tooling that we provide in Visual Studio. So that's going to be the focus for today's talk. And then lastly, this last slide is really just level set. And I think most of you know that when you deploy BCS, you deploy it as a service application. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. BCS is one of the, I think half of the service applications in SharePoint can actually be split across farms easily. And BCS is certainly one of them. We've had customers use dual farms, a content farm and a federated services farm, or a collaboration farm and a corporate farm. Those are all just various topologies that can be deployed. And that is roughly the same as before, so not a whole lot of change there. So that was the context. And this is what I'm going to talk about actually today. So I'm going to talk about some of the changes that we made in connectivity to be more standards-based and what the implications are. I'm going to talk about how you can use BCS in apps, in SharePoint apps. That's totally new. I'm going to talk about cloud and devices also, and how BCS fits into the cloud. I'm going to talk about online. I'm going to talk about on-prem. I'm going to talk about hybrid scenarios that cut across online and on-prem. And then finally, I'm going to call out Duet as a special case. The only caveat is that I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the hybrid scenario. I'm just going to give you just a mention of it in passing, because there's a whole other session tomorrow that goes into the hybrid scenario in a whole lot more detail. And that's really a whole topic in itself. So let's dive straight into the first one, standards-based connectivity. So how many folks here are familiar with OData? Okay, not a lot. I see some hands, not a lot. How many folks here are familiar with REST? Okay, so if you think of OData as being REST, it uses the architectural pattern of REST, which I think most of you are familiar with, but it also adds some schema on top of it, similar to WS star, but a lot more lightweight. So it's really REST. You have RESTful endpoints to get access data. You have a lot of producers of OData. So if you look on the column on the right, you can see that SharePoint has been a producer of OData since the last release. So you can actually go to a URL for a list, a SharePoint list, and get back an OData feed. And what an OData feed is it's a RESTful URL that returns one of three things, either JSON or Atom, or it can be configured to just return plain old XML. So I'm sure most of you will know that web developers in particular are, a lot of web development is moving towards development using just JSON and just XML, and that's what OData is. It's you call a URL, you might say HTTP whack server /customers, and you'll get back a list of customers. You might say whack customers, and then in bracket give an ID, say 53 if it's a numeric ID. You'll get back a specific customer. So that's what OData is. It's a RESTful protocol, but what's important for us is that there's a URL. If you add a $ metadata to the end of the service URL, you get back the whole schema. And that's important because one of the things that we do is we interpret the schema, and then we generate stuff of it. So we generate external data lists, we ought to generate forms. And if it's just plain REST, we wouldn't be able to do that because we wouldn't be able to infer the schema from just JSON or Atom. So that's why OData is kind of useful for us. So we added that. And we added the connector for OData for a variety of reasons. But some of the key reasons are, one is that there is a fair amount of traction. You'll see that on the right, there's a bunch of government data sets that are coming online. And there's an open data government initiative. And a lot of that data is coming out as OData. Also, SharePoint natively produces OData, and SSRS produces OData. And so there's a lot of synergies here. And finally, when I talk about some of the scenarios down a little further into the deck, you'll see how us using OData was made certain scenarios possible and a lot simpler. Okay, so let's quickly mention tooling. So on the right is existing Visual Studio tooling to create OData. It's very simply a RESTful interface on top of SQL. So you can go to VS, you can point at a SQL database. You can say, give me basically first you have to generate an EDMX model, and from there you generate the OData service head. And it's literally point and click to get a first cut OData service from a SQL database. So what Visual Studio gives you is the ability to publish a database as a RESTful endpoint with a metadata endpoint. And then what we can do, and this is going to be part of the demo, which hopefully will work if this network stays up, is I'm going to take VS and point it to an OData service that we provision in Azure. And I'm going to automatically generate the BTC model, and I'm going to upload that, and it's going to automatically be packaged into an app that gets uploaded into SharePoint. And then you can do different kinds of things with that. So the tool on the right, VS for producing or creating an OData service, that's existing tooling. And tooling on the left, where I showed a wizard for generating basically a BTC model, that's a new tool that we added in this release. What makes it particularly useful for us is that REST in OData is built around HTTP verbs. You get data, you get a list of things, you get a single record, you post changes back. And BCS, since most of you are familiar with, has this concept of stereotyped operations. And so for us, the list on the left is how we interpret data. So we need to know what a finder method is, because a finder is what will give us back a list of data. And that's what you see in an external data list. A specific finder will give us one particular record from that list. And those all map very cleanly to the URLs on the right, which is an OData representation. And just from a URL, it will look just like REST. And so here, I'm going to try my first demo. I want to see if this thing will connect. And what I'm going to pop up is something that you probably weren't expecting to see, which is the Netflix developer blog. The reason I popped it up is because they came out with an OData service head on top of basically their catalog. And so I can click on a link, and I can essentially browse to their catalog. And this just shows me the list of collections that are available on the service endpoint. And so I can just pick one of them, titles, because I see there's a collection there. And if I click on that, I should, if my browser is working, see a list of titles from Netflix. Okay, and you see that this is an RSS feed, so this is coming back as Adam. Now, although this is OData, what I'm going to show you is a SharePoint developer site next. So when we did the show of hands, I could see that not a lot of folks are familiar with the app model yet. So if you go out to office, dev.office.com, and you ask for a developer tenancy, or you'll get something that looks roughly like this. And what this lets you do is it lets you connect VS to it and create SharePoint apps, and you have the F5 experience and all of that. And so what I did was I created a little app called, coincidentally, Netflix. And what I did was I'm just going to show you the list of titles. So this is an external data list. Everything has been generated for me by Visual Studio and SharePoint without any code. This is what it looks like. I'm going to stop here because the next demo is where I'm going to show you how we built this app. And that's where I'm going to drill a little further into this experience. But I just wanted to make the point that this is the OData feed that Netflix has. And this is what that looks like in an external data list in SharePoint. And you can actually go to odata.org, and you'll be able to see a whole bunch of places where essentially OData services are being set up. So that was the first part, and it's a very quick demo to just show you what an OData service looks like if you point to it and browse to it in a URL, and then what it looks like in SharePoint. And if the service was editable, which in the case of Netflix it isn't, I could have actually gone to the external data list and popped up the editor and started changing things around. So let's move on. And it's amazing how any talk on either BCS or Duet always boils down to one topic in the end, and that's security. And so here's the IT guy in the deck reminding me that we need to worry about security. And we should just give him a name. We should just call him maybe Tom. Maybe the developer is Jerry and this guy's Tom. So Tom is saying, hey, what about security? And we have various options. So you have the option of doing basic authentication. You have the option of doing Windows authentication. You can roll your own custom auth. And you can manage credentials in Secure Store. You can use Kerberos and you do single sign-on. If you want to roll your own OAuth provider, you can do that. So what we've done is we've packaged the same set or similar set of credentials as in the past, but we also, for OData, we let you plug in some other stuff. And this becomes useful because when I talk about Duet, I'm going to show you that what Duet in the second version does, it connects to something called the SAP Gateway Server. And SAP is essentially exposing all of its enterprise data as OData feeds. So when we started building Duet 2.0, we actually were planning to use OAuth, but the OAuth standard didn't materialize fast enough. And so what we ended up doing was we built a custom provider, which is the thing at the bottom. And what it does is it dynamically generates certificates, user certificates on the fly, and sends those across to SAP. So it was a fairly cheap, minimal effort, and we got single sign-on going. And in the future, we expect that once the OAuth standard becomes fully ratified and some of the open holes are closed, we'll be able to just switch out that authentication provider that we wrote, the one that uses certificates, and instead switch over to OAuth. And at that point, we'd probably also ship an OAuth provider. So that's all fine. I showed you an OData service. I showed you SharePoint. But what most of you probably come here for is, well, what do we do with it? I mean, what's it good for? And so that's really the second part of the talk, which is what changes we made for BCS with the new app model, and what kind of scenarios that gives rise to. So for folks who've been to some of the sessions on the app model, we made a bunch of investments this release for developers. We added the app model itself, which is brand new. we added a whole lot of client-side object model. We added some server-side object model. We added a whole new RESTful ways of basically an underscore API URL way of accessing SharePoint data. There's a whole bunch of other investments that aren't on the slide. We invested in Access. We did the Office app model, and all of those are new for this release. And the good news is that for any of those kinds of apps, you can use BCS to connect those apps to external data. And the one big change that we made in this release is when you do so, BCS becomes scoped to that app. It's not something that you have across your tenancy, because that was one of the feedback we got from the first release, was that it was too rigid. There was a lot of people who were complaining about the fact that they built an app, it used the connection, a BCS model, but then they built another one, and they wanted to change it, but the first one was running, so they had versioning problems. And so what we did was we made it possible to scope BCS models to within an app. That doesn't mean that we've taken away the tenant scope models from the last release. That is still also there. So what you're getting is an alternate way where you can either create a BCS model that is good for your entire tenancy or for your farm or your service application, but you can also create a BCS model now that's scoped to a single app. And if you look at the columns on the right and the left, those are the different kinds of SharePoint and Office apps that are possible in this release. I wasn't planning to talk to them, but since a lot of you haven't seen these or haven't been familiar, you can see that you can either create an app which is immersive, which takes over the whole screen, which basically takes over the browser window, so that's a full-page app. And then from there, you can drill into whatever else the app needs to do. Or it can be an app part. So it can be something that you add to your existing site. So in the first case, what you're doing is you're creating a new app web, which is one level below the site that you're installing the app on or deploying the app to. In the app part, you're basically just extending the current site. And the third one is even more minimal. It basically is ways to package things like custom actions. So those are the three the rough kinds of apps. And on the right is the kinds of Office apps that you can build. So you can build a task pane app that works for Word, Excel, or Project. You can build a content app that currently only works for Excel. Or you can build a mail app which works in Outlook. And all of these apps, or the app model is built around HTML and JavaScript or managed code. And in all cases, what we have is we have a set of APIs that you can use, whether it's JavaScript, whether it's C#, whether it's REST from another platform. And you'll have the full BCS functionality available to you in a way that the apps can get data, but admins can manage those in ways we'll see in the next demo. And I'm just calling out at the bottom that the APIs that we're offering are CSOM and JSOM as before. And we've extended REST so that all of these APIs, we have a whole new set of APIs. And one of the biggest change from an API perspective that we did in this release was to offer them not just for external data lists, but also for external content types. So for example, if you have an external content type for a sales order, which has line items within it, you can actually use APIs that reflect the complex type and not just a simple list. So if that's the case, the next question that the developer will want to know is, if he's building these apps, where are they actually hosted? And for some of you, this may be a repeat from other sessions, but he has three options. The first option is where the app is hosted within SharePoint. So you go to VS, you build an app, it's completely hosted within SharePoint. You deploys to your developer site, and then you have a way to deploy that into your corporate gallery, or you can upload it to the marketplace. But what this app is essentially is, it's a packaging of a WSP from before, with one key thing to note is that there's no managed code here. We don't want to be running managed code in Office 365. We want that to be running in Azure. And so these apps are going to have to rely on HTML and JavaScript alone. And that's why we extended the APIs for BCS so that you can programmatically, just through JavaScript, do anything that you can do with managed code. And if you do that, then you can build an app as a SharePoint hosted app and deploy it as a SharePoint hosted app. And you won't need anything beyond just a SharePoint tenancy and then just the client, the browser. The other two approaches are where the app actually gets deployed to the cloud. And in one model, you bring your own servers. So you essentially are hosting the app yourself. It could be .NET. It might be something that's not. It could be PHP, Rails, whatever you want. And then that server, you have the app, and you have a way of iframing that into your SharePoint site. It's very similar to what Facebook does. So that's one option. And the second option is the auto-hosted model, where you build a SharePoint app. It's similar to the first one, but it has managed code. And when you provision that app, the managed code gets provisioned into Azure, and that's where the code runs. And so from a BCS perspective, if we start with the first one, you're running a SharePoint hosted app, the way it will roughly look is on the left is the green box represents what your app package is. It has a BTC model packaged in it, so it's not reaching out, it's not getting that model from the metadata catalog, which is where the tenant scope models or the farm scope models live, but it's actually storing the app inside it in a special directory or library. And then you can also add list definitions. I'm going to show you the Visual Studio tooling experience, and you'll see that those all get created automatically for you. And then you can create custom pages using HTML and JavaScript. And at runtime, the external list gets created. The pages basically make REST OM or JavaScript OM calls against it. And then that goes and hits the external system. And I'm going to show you the second demo where I'm going to walk you through all of that. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I've opened VS, and for those folks who are familiar with the new app model, it's no different to start with. I'm creating a project. I'm creating an app for SharePoint, and I'm going to call this, let's call it SPC live demo. Okay. Let's see. Okay. SPC live demo, and this is my dev tenant. If you have a dev tenant off of dev.office.com, this is where you put that URL. This is where the models get uploaded. And one thing that I'm going to change is I'm going to create a SharePoint hosted app. And I'm going to say finish. And what it's doing is it's creating an app project for me. Okay. The next thing that I need to do is I need to add an external content type to it, or essentially what you folks know as the BCS model. So I can just go to add, and I can say add content types for an external data source. And I do that, and it's going to want to know where this OData service is. And so I'm going to pick this one. This is a test service that we provisioned. It's running in Azure. And I'm going to give it a name of SPC live demo. And what it's going to do is it's going to go to the OData service. It's going to go to the $metadata URL. It's going to see what entities are there. And it's going to ask me which ones I want. So I'm going to keep it real simple. I'm just going to download a list of contacts. And you'll see at the bottom it has a checklist. So it can actually create list instances automatically for any entity that I select. I can unselect it if I choose, but I'm just going to leave it there. And when I say finish, what it's done is it has automatically generated a contacts model, or an ECT for an external content type. I can add filters here, or right? What it does automatically, it generates a limit filter. I can change that if I want. I'm not going to change it. I'm going to leave it in there. And what it's also done is it's generated a list for me, an external data list. So if I click on this, I should see the name of the list, and I can see that's list/contacts. Now, this is the point of the demo where I ask you guys to avert your glances while I do something that is something I would say don't do what I do, which is what I'm telling BCS here is that this is terribly insecure, but go ahead and do it anyway. What I'm doing is I'm actually connecting to a service, an OData service, and I'm using basic auth, but I'm not using HTTPS, which means that the password is being sent in the clear. And by default, BCS doesn't allow that. So, but if I have to set up a certificate for every demo I give, that's a problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, and I'm going to open this in a text mode. And I'm going to hack it slightly to allow this. In reality, you should never have to do this. And for every other OData services that I showed you that has credentials, you don't have to do it because they're all HTTPS. And I strongly urge you to use HTTPS if you're doing this yourself. Okay, so that should be the only hack I need to do. But I do need to do one more thing. So I need to go to the app manifest. Now, remember the beginning of the demo? I said that we want to have a way for a developer to build an app where an ID admin can manage it. So this is the point where I need to essentially say what the connection is going to be and the credentials. But I don't want to put that in the app. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to the app manifest, and then I'm going to the permissions tab, and I'm saying that this app is going to need permissions for BCS, and that's it. What this tells SharePoint is that when it sees an app, and you're going to see that in a moment, when it gets deployed, it'll know that this needs connection properties, and it'll know that an admin will need to set that up. So the developer's not actually baking any kind of connection string or credentials in. It means that after the app is deployed, the admin can choose what connection to use. This also happens to be very useful because I can take the same app and I can deploy it into SharePoint Online, and I could have it running against an online data service. I can take the app, I can run it against on-prem, or I could even deploy it into online and run it against an on-prem connection, so the hybrid, but the app doesn't change. It's the same app. The only thing that will change is the configuration the admin will do, and I'll show that in a second. But as part of the developer experience, all I'm doing here is telling the app that this is going to need a BCS permission, and that's all. Okay, so that should be it. File save all. And let's build this. Okay. Now, if I wasn't using a permission, this is the point where I just hit F5, and it would have gone, deployed the app to my test tenant, and it would have brought up a browser running in debug. But because I'm using a permission, I'm not going to be able to do that. Instead, I'm going to have to publish this to the file system, and you're going to see why in a second. So what I'm doing here is I'm publishing the app, and you can see a .app here. And now what I'm doing is I'm actually going to go to back to my dev tenant, which I seem to have lost. Okay, let's kick off a new one. Let's go to okay, so you can see this list of apps here that are apps in testing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it that I want to deploy a new app. So it's going to ask me where that app is. and I'm going to, because it's, I publish it to my local file system, I'm going to need to upload it, and it's going to ask me where the app is, and I'm going to browse to it. And from the speed at which I'm going to go through a long list of directories, you can see that I've done this before a few times. Okay, and that's my app. And I'm going to say OK to upload it. Now, what's happened at this point is the app was loaded into SharePoint, but that's all it is at this point. It's just a file. It's sitting in SharePoint. SharePoint hasn't actually done anything with it. And so here what I'm doing is I'm telling SharePoint to deploy the app. This is where SharePoint looks at the app, realizes the app has requested permissions to BCS, and is asking me what connection I want to use. And I was going to actually show you how to set up the connection before, and I forgot to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a connection, and then I'm going to go back and show you how the connection is created. So I'll just do this slightly out of order. So I'm going to say select the Azure connection and trust it. And what it's doing now is it's deploying the app. So this takes a few seconds, and I'll let it wait. You'll know when the app is deployed when the name of the app becomes a link. As long as the app's name is not a link, that means it hasn't yet been fully deployed. Also, it refreshes at a polling rate. So what I tend to do is I tend to refresh the page, and I can see that the app has been deployed. So now when I click on the app, okay, I'm seeing the default page, the default home page for the app. I could have gone in VS, and I could have changed it. So if I go here, there should be a somewhere. Where did it go? Yeah, there it is. Okay. So this is the default page. And you can see that because I changed nothing, it just used the same, it used the default look and feel. Normally, if you build an app, you'd actually change the page and you add a link to the, you'd do something with the connection that you've set up. But I haven't done any of that, so I'm just going to go in, and I'm going to point to the list that I know from Visual Studio is provisioned because I asked it to provision a list. And VS, it told me it was, by default, it was calling it list/contacts. And when I do that, if I didn't leave out any steps, I should see the list of contacts. So clearly, I've done this enough times now that I managed to do it without making any mistakes, which is always good. And I can go in and I can edit this just to show you that the form is auto-generated as well. And let's call this SPC demo rocks. And I save it. And I now have a contact call. Oh, I don't have a contact because it's complaining that one of the fields is out of range. Okay, I need to check. This is a test service that our test team uses, and they try to, it's not exactly a demo service, but that should do it. Okay, and you can see that the data was edited in the backend. So what I did was a very basic app. I connected to the OData URL that was in Azure. I automatically generated the model. I asked Visual Studio to automatically create a list for me. And then I just provisioned the app. And the app provisioned the list. There are a lot more useful things you can do. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But before I do that, I'm going to actually go back, as I promised, and show you how the connection was set up so that I close the loop on that. So let's go to the admin page for my SharePoint site. Now, for folks who are familiar with the URLs, you may have realized that the whole demo is being done against SharePoint Online. If I could have done it against on-premises, it would have been a similar experience. So here what I've done is I've gone to the secure store. I'm just going to create new application ID. And let's call this SPC live demo. And SPC demo. What this is it's telling the secure store that I'm creating a set of credentials, which are a username, password credentials. I'm giving myself as the admin, and I'm saying that everybody could use this. So let's all users, everyone. And now what I've just done is in the secure store service. Oh, I left out a display. Stuff.com. So what I've just done is I've told the secure store service that there's a set of credentials here, which are a username and a password. I could have created a set of credentials with anything else that the service that my service needed, but since I'm just using basic auth, I just did that. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to have to set the credentials, and I'm going to give the very cunningly created and highly secure username and password. And what this means is that an admin can go back and change this later. One thing I didn't mention was that because this is SharePoint Online, the credentials that I created were group credentials. If you're connecting from an online, so SharePoint Online to an online service, we only support group credentials. If you want to connect either from on-prem to on-prem or from online to cloud to on-prem, the hybrid scenario, we will also support user credentials. But what we haven't done is we haven't supported user credentials from cloud to cloud. And there's some reasons for that. If anybody's interested, you can ask me later, but that's one of the restrictions. So now what I've done is I've created the secure store credentials. Now I'll go to the BCS admin page, and this is also something that we added new into SharePoint Online, is I have a link here which is manage BDC models and external content types. This is the same as the last release, but what is new is what is there below, which is we've added the ability to create connection settings for apps. And so I'm just going to say I want to create a connection setting, a new connection setting to an online service, and I'm just saying SPC live demo. I'm just giving the URL that I used for the service. And so, and I'm telling it that get the credentials from Secure Store. So SPC live demo. You'll notice that there's some other options as well. I can tell it to use not use authentication and things like that, but I'm just going to go with what I have. And that's how the connection is created. So then you'll have noticed that when the app was being deployed into SharePoint, SharePoint gave me a list of connections that and asked me to pick one. If I'd done this setup before I'd deployed the app, this connection would have also shown up there, and I could have selected this one. So this is how I can separate the actual development of the app from the management of the credentials and the management of the service URL. So those are two different things. So when I talked about the when I started my talk, I was talking about the two personas, the admin and the developer. So you just saw what those two personas do in this demo. Oh, one other thing I didn't show you, but I'm just going to talk through in the interest of time, is this is a hands-on lab that we have, which basically changes the experience. So we showed you a flat list of contacts, and this just has some HTML and JavaScript, not much, and CSS, and reformats that into a set of contact cards. And the code to do that is essentially, I'm just going to show you the 2 or 3 key lines that you need to look at is this one, yeah. So here I'm making a call to underscore API. So that's a new URL format that we added in 15. And I'm saying get by title. In this case, it was employees. And then what I'm doing is I'm selecting a set of fields, because if you noticed when I auto-generated those the form, there were a lot of fields. And for most cases, you won't want 25 fields or 50 fields, and you just want the set of fields that you need. And I did that, and I set a post back so that it posts back to using Ajax to a JavaScript function which actually goes and populates the HTML, and that's what creates the contact card using the CSS that's in this hands-on lab. So that's just an example. You can do all kinds of things, and you don't really need to write managed code for any of that. So that was the second half of my demo. And let's go back to the deck now. And I wanted to jump straight into this topic because this comes up a lot. I showed you HTML and JavaScript, and a lot of devs, most devs, some devs, don't want to do that. They want to write managed code. And can you write that? And the answer is sure. It's pretty straightforward. If you want to use BCS with managed code, the way that will work is that the app will look the same way as it did before. It connects to an external, you just provision a list definition. And then the code that calls BCS is running in managed code that's being hosted in Azure or the dev-hosted site. And you'll see that that's changed from REST-OM and JavaScript OM. It's now become REST-OM and CSOM. So that was a change. OK? So any questions about that before I move on? This is the app model. Yeah, go ahead. No, the API still exists. And so you can use, for example, a complex ECT, external content type. You can use that in managed code, and you can also do that from JavaScript now because we extended the same API into the CSOM, the client. And so not only do you have what you had before, you have some more.
So if you use the REST API, you get complex types, or
no, so what you can do is for complex types, you can use the JavaScript OM, but not the REST OM, because the REST OM starts getting messy if you start trying to package a complex type into a REST, basically a URL. Sure.
Do you have to write your managed code for Azure, or can you host it in any?
Anywhere. So that is the two. What I said was the difference between an auto-hosted app and what is it? The one where you roll your own is exactly that. In the one where you roll your own, you're basically deploying it to your server. It could be an IS server, it could be a PHP, it could be whatever you want. It can be whatever. Yes. OK. So let's move on.
When you deployed it to SharePoint hosted. Why didn't you deploy it auto-hosted?
I could have. I just picked one. This is the one I picked.
And when you deployed provider hosted, that's what the gentleman was asking, that you can have your own IaaS hosted?
Yes. So what I would have had to do is right on the first step, the wizard, when I created the SharePoint app, I had selected SharePoint hosted. I would have changed it to whatever I want, either the auto-hosted or the other one. OK, so now let's talk about the different cloud options and devices. So BCS, if you think of it as a 2x2 matrix, one is where is SharePoint? SharePoint could be on-premise. It could be on the cloud. You have those two options. Your data could be on-premises. It could be in the cloud. You have those two. And we support all four combinations. So the one on the left, use BCS to connect SharePoint on-premises to data that's on-premises. That's what we shipped SharePoint 2010 with. The one where that's orange, that's sorry, the one that's green. So that's something that we rolled into SharePoint Online about a year ago. Actually, last SharePoint conference was when Jeff announced it. So it's been about a year. And so in the last year, we've essentially added these two boxes that are in between. So, and the red one is the real big one, which is the ability to create hybrid connections. And I'll spend some time talking about that. So first, the online to online connection. When we first shipped a version of this into the service a year ago, we only supported WCF. That's not fully true, because it turns out that by mistake we also supported SQL, and there were people who were blogging about it. And then we had to shut it off because we knew it didn't work fully. It was one of those things that almost worked, but we knew it didn't fully work, and we didn't want to have customers depending on it. But we went back and we fixed that. So now we support WCF, OData, and SQL Azure, and that's in our data center. For a non-Microsoft data, basically a non-Azure data center, will support OData and WCF. So that should be pretty straightforward. Any questions about that? I'd imagine not. Okay. So the hybrid configuration is what's new. What we've done is that when I showed you when I was creating the app connection in the BCS admin page, there's one option that said create a connection for an on-premises connection. So what we've done is we've modeled a connection in two ways. The first way is the one I'm showing you on screen, where we're modeling a reverse proxy that's sitting in the DMZ. And so if you tell BCS what your properties are for the reverse proxy, then what SharePoint and BCS will do is it'll manage 3 sets of authentication for you. It'll manage the authentication from SharePoint Online to the reverse proxy, and it uses client certs for that. So that's where SharePoint Online or Office 365 is telling the reverse proxy, hey, this is a trusted tenancy, and there's some configuration you need to do. So that way, the reverse proxy knows it's coming from Office 365, it's not being spammed from somewhere. Then the second authentication we do is to SharePoint. So once the call reaches SharePoint on premises, then SharePoint will think of this as an on-premises user. It will make, it does a bunch of stuff. We authenticate to SharePoint, and then we do some identity mapping, because your identity in the cloud is different from your identity on premises. And then SharePoint on-prem is going to make the final call to an OData service that's on premises. And this is what will work out of the box. If you want to do a little more work, this is custom development. What you also is possible using the same modeling technique is, instead of using reverse proxy, you can actually use service bus, where essentially you're using a relay service, and that's sitting in the cloud in the Azure data center. And so if you go that route, you essentially have to write the relay service yourself, and you have to write a client proxy that sits on-prem. It's not a lot of code. It's something that we'd have liked to ship out of the box, but we didn't have time for. But those are the two configurations. Note that in both configurations, having a SharePoint on-premises is required. So what we've done is we've modeled this as most customers have a SharePoint on-premises. They want to move to the cloud. There is data that's stopping that, or there are things that are blocking that move. And so this is something that's a progression. It's happening over time. And as they create their tenancy in SharePoint Online, we're enabling them to move apps and move basically content into the cloud and still manage their connections to on-premises data. Because what we heard from customers was that it's not easy for them to move data into the cloud, but it's fairly straightforward them, or easier for them to move apps. And so this is the way we have it right now. And I think there's a session sometime today, and the search team is going to show something similar, where they're going to show the same configuration, and where you can also search for content in SharePoint Online, and it's going to query not only content that's stored in SPO, but it's also going to run the query down using the same channel to an on-premises SharePoint farm, and present you back with a set of search results that cut across both farms. And both search and us, we use the same mechanism for this, and the same configuration. So that's all goodness, but there are some limitations. So the limitations are that there are a set of things that don't work, and one of those is search on BCS data. It does not work in SharePoint Online. Also, there are some things that don't work within an app. So if you write your own forms or rely on auto-generated forms, that's all good. But if you want to use info path within an app, that's not going to work. Also, the BDC web parts don't work. The preferred direction is where you write your own UI using either the CSOM or the JavaScript OM or the REST OM. So the next thing I'm going to talk about briefly is mobile apps. So it turns out that if you do this, it's only one short hop to also take the same list and essentially offline that to a phone. And there's a Microsoft SharePoint SDK that does that for you. So you can go into Visual Studio, you can point to a list, and that could be either a SharePoint list or an external data list, and it'll generate an app for you and the XAML for you, where you have a mobile application that will essentially run through Office 365 and through this hybrid connection and get data. And that's one of the options that you have. The other thing that we added, and this is also kind of a mobile scenario, is that in SharePoint 2010, BCS only works in a pull mode. So you do something and it pulls data. You do something and it pulls data. That something might be a solution that's running in SharePoint. It might be a page that you go to and the page refresh triggers it. But what it can't do is it has no notion of data changing and being notified. So we changed that. And so now in this release, BCS has the ability to listen to external events. And so the way it works is that typically users will, or an app could also do this, but essentially subscriptions get set up. And once you subscribe to data or notifications in this case, when a notification or change notification needs to come, it gets sent back by the external system. So as an example, the Duet offering builds on this, and we can set up notifications coming from SAP to come to SharePoint and then do things inside SharePoint apps. So for example, we have notifications coming out of SAP and triggering off workflow inside SharePoint as one of the scenarios. Okay, so this is my final demo. And instead of a demo, this is something that I could not get to work in this environment. So I'm going to instead show a video of this. So this is an app that we use. It's a dog food app called, it's affectionately called Bugger. But what it does is it lets our team see bugs on our phones. So this is all leveraging BCS and SharePoint. And the connection is, so this is what the app looks like on a phone. I click on the tile, I sign in. And I see a list of apps, bugs that have been assigned. These are bugs that are coming from an OData service that's running on premises that's going against our bug database. I can click on one of these things. They're color-coded by priority. And if I click on one of them, I can edit it in place. And so you'll see that happen just now. And I have different views of the same data. So this is a SharePoint list or an external data list with multiple views. So here's where we clicked on a bug, and you can see the data. And I can go in and edit that. So that's the edit icon. I can go ahead and change something. So this is where an external data list has been offlined to SharePoint. But what we also did was we set up the push notification to the phone. And so eventually you'll see a notification pop up that says the bug has been modified. And that just shows you the notifications around. And you see that I got a notification. This is where the product studio, or basically a bug database in the back on-premises, essentially send a message, a notification all the way down through SharePoint. So what this is showing you is the same external data list in SharePoint. And these are the different views that we had. So one is the open by me view, and one is the assigned by me. And we use Visual Studio to automatically generate the, so that this just shows you the product studio database. And this is the OData service that sits on top of it. And you can see this looks like any other OData service. This is a first version of our BCS generation tool before it was built into Visual Studio. So this is a little old. And as I said before, the models could be either tenant scoped or app scoped, and you saw that it was being uploaded into a tenant scope, the same BDC catalog from SharePoint 2010. And this shows the app building experience for the phone. So here what I'm saying is that I want a Windows Phone SharePoint application. And when I do that, it's going to ask me what list. So I'm adding a list to it. So this is a SharePoint list. I could give it a regular SharePoint list, or in this case, I'm giving it an external data list. Rather, I gave it the site first, and now I'm selecting the list. And what it's doing is it's auto-generated the XAML for me, and I'm just building the app. So far, I haven't done any coding. It's just been all boilerplate code that's been generated. And that when I do that, I get an app with the forms already generated. And then I know that people went in and added code to the app. The app as shown did have code in it. I'm not trying to say that it was all auto-generated, but a lot of the XAML was auto-generated from the list definition. Okay, so now I showed you a bunch of stuff, and it all looks complex. At this point, developers are probably thinking, well, that's pretty powerful, but the admin guy is probably freaking out. So what we did is, and this is for us as well as for an admin, is if these apps are running in SharePoint Online, when something doesn't work, what we don't want to have is essentially customers calling our ops team or support team and saying, hey, things are broken, especially if the problem is actually an on-premises connection that's failing. So what we did is we gave a partial, where we created a new partial commandlet that lets a tenant admin selectively download the logs for BCS. And this is roughly what it looks like. You can specify the user ID for a person who saw the problem, the correlation ID that he sees on the screen, and then the time range and the maximum number of rows. And if you do that, you can get the logs down from SharePoint Online. You can't do this in general because of compliance reasons, but this is a set of BCS-related logs that can be used to debug problems on premises. And just kind of closing out on this topic, this is an all-up summary of what's new in BCS between SharePoint 2010 and 2013. I'm not going to walk through the table, but if you guys want to go back and look at the slides, because I know they'll be posted, you'll have this. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into Duet. And right at the beginning, when we started the deck, we were talking about the developer, we were talking about the admin. The guy we forgot about, or the guys, were actually the users, the information workers. And they want their mission-critical data. And quite often enough, that's in SAP. And when they want that data, they want it on premises. They want that, from the cloud. There's a little survey that was done, and we think that roughly maybe 10% of users actually use an SAP UI, and 90% of users actually want the information out of SAP, but they want it in other formats. They want it in Office, they want it in SharePoint, they want it on mobile devices, they want it on slates, all of that. And so what Duet Enterprise does for 2.0 is, firstly, it looks very similar to 1.0. If you're familiar with Duet from 1.0, there's not a whole lot of surprises. It's still these three big things. I'm not going to walk through all the bullet items, but it's essentially a foundation, a set of tools, and a set of ready-to-use capabilities. What the foundation does is it's kind of like a sanity level thing. We want Duet to be the foundation where you build your apps, and there's certain things that you should not have to worry about. So security, for example, we've done the single sign-on. The supportability, so we have end-to-end tracing that cuts through SharePoint and SAP. So if you have a problem, you can give it to an admin, and they'll be able to trace it all the way back and forth across the two stacks. And finally, the tools on both sides are becoming a lot simpler to use. So if you use the tools from 1.0 and you used it right at the beginning before the service packs, it is hard. It was to build a simple application, it take hours, days, weeks maybe. And then there was some simple wizards created, and that did cut down a lot of the development time. But what you'll see is that with the tooling that we added on our side, as well as the tooling that got added on the SAP side on the ABAP workbench and on the NetWeaver stack, and the fact that both sides are kind of closing down on OData. So our tools natively consume OData. Their services are natively producing OData. We've done a bunch of interrupt testing so that it all just works together. And our development tools on both sides are basically plugging into that. So there's a lot of things that have just become simpler to use. The other, in terms of ready-to-use capabilities, it's just the same set that it was in 1.0. So we have workflow, integrated workflow. We have integrated reporting. We have role sync. We have profile sync. The one new capability that we added this release was the ability for SAP to send us notifications. And those notifications can do different things. So it's not just tasks anymore. It can be an event firing and saying, hey, this account changed status, or this customer is now referenceable, or something like that. The other big, and this is the big change. I'm going to, and maybe in the interest of time, skip some of this. Okay. The one big change that we did was Duet also now works online. So just like we took BCS online and we enabled hybrid scenarios, Duet also works in the cloud. So you can actually go into SharePoint Online, and if you have an enterprise tenancy, you can add Duet to it. There's a way to do that. And having done that, all of these capabilities that I showed you will work in SharePoint Online as well. They'll be connected to SAP on-premises, but you'll be able to sync. So it means that single sign-on will work all the way across SharePoint Online, SharePoint on-premises, AD, SAP. All of that is taken care of. It means that we'll sync roles, user roles, and their permissions all the way from on-premises SAP all the way up into SharePoint Online. So if you want to ACL a report, and you want to ACL it to, let's say Mario, because he's sitting in the front row and I know him, and Mario is a sales manager, you can do that. And all those roles for sales manager being taken from SAP on-premises. We had to do a bunch of engineering work to do that, and it all worked out. And so these are some of the solutions. The interesting thing is that all these solutions are, in fact, built by Mario, which is why I called him out. The interesting thing is that if you now build any of these solutions, so here as an app, okay, these are not built as apps, but if somebody went and built them as an app, these same solutions could be deployed on premises, they could be deployed in the cloud. The app itself would not have to change. It would just work. Whether it's running on-prem, whether it's running in SPO, it would just work. And that's partly the promise of Duet. Is not that it's terribly flashy, it's just that things just work across SharePoint and SAP. And this is just, okay, maybe I lied about some things being flashy. This is a little flashy, and I can see that. Okay, Yeah, so this lets you select across a bunch of ranges and the sales numbers change. And again, if these apps were built as SharePoint apps using the new app model, these would work on premises or online. So these are just some examples. I'm going to skip these. This is another example of a customer, Sandvik, this is the SAP UI that they used for invoice approval before they rolled out Duet. And this is the new approval. So first of all, they integrated into SharePoint, and that's what this looks like. And then they actually integrated the workflow using Duet. And this is what an invoice approval looks like. So this is running in production for Sandvik. This is a CRM application that a company called Omnicell used. So this is before, and after it's been baked into Outlook. So it uses BCS and Duet, and this is what it looks like inside Outlook. So all their sales activities are being managed here. And then we have a bunch of partners who are also building solutions. I'm not going to talk about the partner solutions. I'm just calling it out. Now, I think I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to do the demo. This is a screenshot demo. If you want to see it, there's a booth in the partner hall. The SAP guys have it set up, and they have the Duet demos running there. And you can see a live version of this. So just calling out again, one last slide, which is how we made this work in the cloud. And it's the same things that I showed for BCS, except that the OData services are now coming out of SAP Gateway. And that's the last slide. It just shows a comparison of what's available on-prem for Duet and what's available in SharePoint Online, so in the cloud. So you can see that a lot of things are there and a lot of things are still being added. Okay, so that's it for my slides. Any questions? Sure. Yes, so, and that's one of the differentiations, I guess, between Duet and Gateway as well, because Duet will support both the SOAP models as well as the OData models, and they'll support the old style of doing things using solutions and the new style of doing apps. So that's all still there. That is correct. So SOAP and OData are both available for on-premises. For online, it's OData only. Yes. I didn't understand the question.
No CSOM.
CSOM is there, yes. Yeah, but it won't work against SOAP. It'll only work against OData. Thanks. So what I will not get into is the sales motion side of things, mainly because that's not my competency. I would add, say the best thing is to go downstairs to the partner hall and talk to the SAP folks who have a Duet booth. Yeah, it's basically a SAP, but we build it jointly together and they're selling it right now. But I think the final answers to some of those questions are still being discussed, and so the one thing I'm certainly not going to talk about is licensing here. I'm sorry? I do not have a business card, but my name's on the session, so you can just find me that. Yeah. Yeah.
You showed the on-prem and the cloud-based stuff. Can you get data SharePoint Online, or can you get data service from the gateway? Or do you have to go for an on-prem SharePoint instance to get that data?
Okay, so that's a great question. So the question is, can you go from SharePoint Online directly to the OData gateway that's on-prem and bypass the SharePoint server that's on-premises? And right now the answer to that is no. The reason is because the OData gateway is not built to be deployed into the DMZ. It is possible that they have something in the future, and if they did, then we could consider it. But at this point, it has to go through a SharePoint on-premises.
Proxy that's
Yes, or you could write your own proxy.
because you have customers that don't have SharePoint business in-house and they want to expose their data externally.
Right, but the thing that will caution you, the thing that will break in that scenario is that you won't be able to do single sign-on because for us, we don't support user-level authentication from the cloud. We only do groups. So, so that's something that. Yeah, there was some questions. We talked to a bunch of customers about whether they wanted that, and it turned out that overwhelmingly they did not. So they did not want to have anything where user credentials are being stored in online. And if we did that, that's what would happen.
So you just use the network gateway user mapping to map like credentials?
No, so when we do an online to online, we just have a group credential, and that's stored online. What we don't do is we don't store user credentials. Well, single sign-on is different. We actually do single sign-on because. Yeah, so that we do. So if we model it as a single group credential, that's fine. If we start modeling it as individual user credentials, that is something that most customers are not comfortable with. They're not comfortable with us storing all of that in the cloud. What they are fine with is us establishing trust between two SharePoint servers or two farms, one that happens to be on-prem and one happens to be in the cloud, because then, yeah, well, we secure that pipe. Yeah.
So what happens with your online credential? Sorry, you're getting kicked off.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So what happens with your online credentials? So say, it's same on that .com as well online, pass it down.
We map.
Mapping internally.
Yeah, we map.
Three mappings. You'll have your
Yeah.
SAP ID, your internal.
We actually have more mappings than that, but yeah. For a simple, so it turns out that anytime we jump from between cloud and on-prem in both directions, there are times when we have to change mappings from an online to an on-prem, and SAP has its own. So we map everywhere. That's one of the sanity level things where we say there's some things you should not have to worry about, and the identity mapping is one of those. I thought we did. So I know that we did, but I think that we're moving away from that.
Talk a little bit about performance on BCS. The previous release, I think about 2000, performance was not worthwhile.
So, okay, so the question is about performance for BCS. I know that it's better than last release because we did a bunch of work for that. I don't remember the numbers.
Do you have any numbers published? Is there a white paper? So I mean, at the end of the day, if you're pulling data from like
I know we are going to. Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly it's a fair question. I know we will be publishing performance numbers. I just don't know if they've been published yet.
somebody here or somebody at Microsoft can reach out to
Just send me an email afterwards. My name's on the session. Which one? So what you should do is you should ask the SAP folks downstairs. One of the things that we are investigating is the whether we, instead of making VMs available, we make that available online.
Yeah. Do they have that?
Not yet. So it's a, we have it very selectively. So when you do the velocity events, that's how we actually run them.
The velocity is on the SAP side. There's one running at there's one. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Any?
You're running the session next on the hybrid.
Yeah, the hybrid session is tomorrow. Also, so anybody who wants more information, the hybrid, that's tomorrow at 1:45. Okay, you're welcome. So, any more questions, or I don't have a card on me right now. Okay.
Walter.
Hey, Walter. Yeah, nice to meet you in person.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thanks everybody.